and um, and I want to talk about Southern music and how music is recorded and how it's distributed. We talked about John Henry before, but today I want to talk about folk music and some other kinds of music that are come especially out of the South and are transmitted right at the end of our period, right around 1919 and 1920. So to begin with, I want to talk about Tom Dooley, because why not? Uh, this you probably have heard the song "Hang Down Your Head, Tom Dooley, Poor Boy, You're Bound to Die." Might be able to play it, but no, I won't be able to play it because then I won't be able to put it on YouTube. So um, you know the song, I hope. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley. Hang down your head and cry. Okay, that's the song. Poor boy, you're bound to die. It's a murder ballad that's in the tradition of ballads of the 16th century, just like John Henry was a ballad. It's usually about murder, the tragic fate of lovers, and it predicts death at the end. It describes, though, a real story that captures how the mountains were changing after the American Civil War. And this is a song that goes to #1 on Billboard in 1958. And Grail Marcus calls it this growing obsession with what he calls the old weird America. So this song had been floating around, the Tom Dooley song had been floating around Western North Carolina for basically 80 years or so, and lots of people in Western North Carolina knew the song, but it's not until the middle of the 20th century that it becomes this huge Billboard sensation. It describes a real story about how the mountains were changing. The real name is Tom Dula, Dula, but in the Western North Carolina town of Happy Valley, I kid you not, Happy Valley, people in Western North Carolina pronounced the A as an E often. So this is how we get, Grand Old Opera turns into Grand Old Opry. So in Western North Carolina, people often pronounce the A sound as E, and so Tom Dula became Tom Dooley. Dooley was from a wealthy planter family that owned the best land and lots of slaves in Western North Carolina. And Dooley entered the Confederacy in the 42nd Regiment in March of 1862. There were many others in the hills, though, who were white non-slaveholders, who either hid out during the war or fought for the Union. Many Western North Carolinians fought for the Union. They crossed over into Tennessee, which was Union occupied at that point, Western Tennessee, and joined Union regiments. And so there were very sharp divides among white Southerners in the mountains of Western North Carolina. There were black Southerners in Western North Carolina, but not a whole lot. And there were divides between pro-Union and pro-Confederate folks. Now, Dula returned after the war to a very different kind of Western North Carolina. Most former slaves are gone, have left Western North Carolina. And while most of Dula's wealth is gone, he's well known. He's disliked among men in the community, in part because he's well liked among women in the community. He sleeps with a woman named Ann Foster before the war. And after the war, he comes back and she's married to Mr. Felton, a man named Felton. But Felton has another bed in the house. And so Dooley and Ann regularly sleep together in the other bed in Mr. Felton's house. Ann's cousin Pauline comes into town, and Dula sleeps with her. But Pauline has come to Happy Valley for a particular reason, and that's because she has syphilis, and is visiting a doctor in town for the cure of it. She doesn't tell this to Tom or anyone else. Then Tom discovers Laura Foster, who's I think about 15 years old, and has sex with her as well. 3 days later, he starts to get a canker on his penis, and he tells the doctor that he probably got it from Laura Foster, 15-year-old Laura Foster, and then he tells people he will put through Laura Foster. So he borrows a neighbor's mattock, which is used for digging and clearing brush. Apparently he tells Laura he will marry her. He fills a canteen with moonshine, and he takes her up into the hills. No one sees either one for a while, and they assume they've run off together. A week or so later, Dula returns and says that he has no idea where she is. Now, politics matters a lot here in this story because Dula was a Confederate, and many people in the mountains had been dodging Confederate home guards or joined the Union during the war. And they try to hold an inquest, and Dula disappears across the mountains to Tennessee and changes his name. By then, Anne and Pauline talk, and Pauline hears from Anne that they need to hide evidence. She tells her to sweep away brush. Pauline asks if there's a body there. Anne says, no, the body's up there, and points to a hill. And the inquest then travels up to the hillside, and they discover Laura's body in a grave that's only 4 feet long and 3 feet wide. The body has gash marks in the breast. The sheriff goes across the mountains, finds where Dula is, grabs him, ties him up, and brings him back to stand trial. Dula has no money, but he's defended by Governor Zebulon Vance, who is probably told that Dula, a former Confederate soldier, is not going to get justice in Western North Carolina because they're all draft dodgers and Republicans up in Western North Carolina, and these people will not give justice to a Republican. And so that's Governor Vance there, and he had been the governor during the Civil War, and he defends Tom Dula. Okay, so Dula's hated in part because he's a former Confederate soldier and he sleeps around with other people's wives. The state background, though, is Reconstruction, where ex-Democrats believed that they wouldn't get justice in a state where there was so much resentment of the Confederacy. And it becomes a real cause in the mountains. Many people visit the trial, and then because there are irregularities, it's tried again in North Carolina Supreme Court. Until the end, Dula thinks he can get away, having sawed away at his ankle restraints in jail. But by 1868, almost 3 years after this event, he realizes that he's going to die, and he confesses privately, but tells people he's innocent. His execution is actually messed up, and he's hanged, but the drop is only 2 feet, so it doesn't break his neck, and he dies over 10 minutes later from asphyxiation. Okay, so the song spreads by the 1870s, but not very far. It's really only in the 20s it's really only in the 20s that he is. There's a recorded version by Grayson and Whittier. Grayson's great uncle was a man from Tennessee who helped them arrest Dula. Now, there are 2 versions of this song. One version is, talk about a troll. Okay, I'm just going to ignore the troll. 2 versions of the story. One is where Tom is a heroic, innocent soldier, but really it's really the fault of Anne, who is jealous of Laura Foster. Anne was separately tried. That's a Democratic version of the story. And the Republican version of the story is that Tom is the murderer, and this is supported by, oh my goodness, how do I block this person? Can someone figure out how to block Mr. Troller to clean? I can't block you. Okay, good to know. All right, what happens after the war is that there's a lot of debt settling that's connected to grudges. Now, this is from a film from the Tom Dula, which became a kind of famous movie after the song was famous, and this is the story of his killing her with his knife. So there's a lot of debt settling in this period. A lot of people going back and forth connected to grudges. At the same time, men have returned from the war capable of killing other people, having seen so much death on the battlefield. Thanks, Gabe. I think that worked. Ha ha, lovely. All right. it just kept scrolling. I didn't know what to do. Oh, yay. All right. We are back. Um, okay, so a lot of debt settling, a lot of grudges. The same time, men have returned from the war capable of killing. It's good to know this, how to do this. So thanks, everybody. Um, People, one of the things about the war, the American Civil War, is that people get used to killing other people. And there's a more or less natural unwillingness to kill that, according to Dave Grossman, a lieutenant colonel who writes a book called On Killing, according to Grossman, the more or less natural unwillingness to kill that we all have is drilled out of people during wartime. When soldiers return from the war, according to Grossman, that bar is lowered. So Tom kills with a knife, but as guns become much cheaper after the war, particularly pistols and repeating rifles, there are a number of other revenge killings that continue for decades. This tombola story is one. There are, in fact, 11 books on this, all from Western North Carolina, about the tombola story. One is the doula side, and the other is the foster side. Luckily, that doesn't lead to murder and mayhem, but the Hatfields and McCoys, the similar story about some people who fled the draft and other people who didn't, is carried on through in Western North Carolina. And then, as we saw with Prohibition, these families become much more powerful and much more rich, and they settle their grudges 50 and 60 and and 70 years later. These grudges are resolved, these Civil War grudges. And so there are songs about bad men then that become very popular in the mountains. Jesse James, Tom Dooley. And by the 1920s, they become staples of roadhouse music, which is songs that are played in white bars. Okay, so that's the white Southern version of songs. And so there are a whole lot of, if you've ever listened to outlaw country or something like that, this is really sort of where that starts, is murder ballads and things like that, that then become a really important part of country music. So the technology, yeah, the grudge revenge dynamic is strange. Partly it's because of the song itself that people sort of tell the song in a way that answers one another. I think there's also, I mean, this is why the grudge revenge thing. Part of this is the weakness of authority in the South, and when I talked before about lynching and things like that, there is in the rural South, particularly in places like Georgia and particularly rural places where there's not a lot of where justice isn't often done regularly, you get people who are sort of considered unhanged, right? That they should have been hanged for committing some horrible crime, and then families sort of kill one another and cousins back and forth. The same thing happens in Afghanistan now. The same thing happens in India, in the areas where there's sort of Muslim and religious killings. Yeah, and everyone wants to be Batman, and so what happens is that there's a grudge killing, and then people will respond to the grudge killing sometimes 5 or 6 or 7 years later. And the kind of interest in that, the kind of fascination with death, then becomes a sort of basis for music. Okay, so recorded sound goes back to the 1880s. This is the first phonograph from around 1877, the Edison one, but people have phonographs in their houses as early as the 1880s, but it's mostly rich people. And the sound that was recorded, though, was hard to reproduce. It went on cylinders like the one that you'll see here that quickly degraded. Yeah, I think it was partly Reconstruction and partly the small government aspect. I think it's the combination of those two, that Democrats thought they weren't going to get justice when Republicans ruled, and Republicans thought they weren't going to get justice when Democrats ruled. And then with a relatively weak enforcement mechanism, you get this sort of killing and revenge killing and things like that. So this is the phonograph recording in and then this is Berliner's gramophone, which is much more complicated. So these cylinders, there are still cylinders around, but they break down pretty easily. So a lot of the John Henry songs that I looked at turned out that they were available in cylinders, but you couldn't play them because they were so degraded. The songs that were made were mostly of opera singers, famous tenors singing sentimental songs. By 1884, though, Berliner comes up. Emil Berliner in Germany develops a disc recording. It's made of hard rubber, and this allows duplication, relatively cheap duplication of music, and it becomes a sort of competitor to Edison's product. And in the end, the gramophone wins out over the competing Edison instrument. But it's not really until the 1917 that we see recorded music come into being, and that's because these old methods, you had to yell into a microphone. And so the people you heard were opera singers, right? Or you heard bands, because regular singing just wasn't going to cut it. If you were singing with a banjo or something like that near a gramophone, unless you shouted, you couldn't hear anything. But the condenser microphone, which is developed in 1917, is very different because it amplifies the sound in a way that couldn't be amplified before. And this then leads to the explosion of phonographs music. And singers go from being people who had very, very strong voices to crooners and things like that. So people who could sing quietly but well became much more popular in this period. So by 1922, there are 100,000 radio sets manufactured in the United States. In 1924, 500,000 radios are available in the United States, and that's another method for the distribution of music. Is radios. There are 1,400 stations broadcasting to 3 million radio sets by 1924. So at the end of our period, we have recorded music both in phonographs and in radios. And this is where Fiddlin' John Carson and others come along. Fiddlin' John Carson, about to be evicted here, is a fiddle player, one of the first people recorded, and becomes a kind of local celebrity. What's interesting about Fiddlin' John Carson, though, is that he tells everyone that he's a hillbilly. And he tells everything that his is pure white music. And he tells everyone that that he's from the hills and the mountains. He's from a place where Georgia met Tennessee and nobody knew which side they were on. In fact, Fiddlin' John Carson worked at cotton mill, and he worked alongside mostly black laborers who unloaded bales into cotton mills. And many of the songs that he sang, which he claimed were country songs, were in fact African-American songs. And so there's this weird way in which Carson kind of creates country music, but much of the sort of source and energy of music, the songs themselves, come not just from the white South, but from African Americans. And now I want to talk about African American music to sort of change gears decidedly. So when we start in the 1880s and 1890s, turn of the century, African American music tends to be, believe it or not, what's called minstrel music. Now, minstrel shows were the old, the Jim Crow songs with white people who were dressed up in black paint, and they sang Carry Me Back to Old Virginia and Song of the South and these other songs that were, about people remembering the old plantation South. But by the 1880s and 1890s, black musicians take over minstrel songs. And so what we see, Al Jolson is an example of this, is, you see on the right here, Williams and Walker's musical comedy series, is basically black people taking over blackface and playing the same songs here. So there's these songs, Saucy Little Sadie and Diana and Just the Same and Fast, Fast World, but they're sung by black musicians who in fact do cover their faces with burnt cork, just like the old minstrels do. And they create these, they do ragtime songs, minstrel songs, and it's different from the minstrel shows in that they're black performers doing Southern routines for the most part. African-American music and dance then enters vaudeville. and we talked about vaudeville before, it's African Americans that become very, very popular in vaudeville starting around 1909 and 1910, often performed in all black revues in say, 1910. This on the right is a minstrel production with black performers called Bandana Land in 1908. And that on the left is Pearl Hobson, whose stage name was Minnie Brown, who became a very famous singer in New York in 1908 and 1909. And then she actually travels all around the world with a review of basically African American singers. And she travels to Petersburg in Russia. She settles in Petersburg in Russia. She stays there, and she much prefers Tsarist Russia to the United States. And she actually dies of typhus in 1919, very young, as a famous performer. It's minstrel singers like Ma Rainey and W.C. Handy that create a very new kind of music, though. This is Ma Rainey right here. And this is Georgia Tom, which is Georgia Tom. What is his last name? Bear with me here for a second. I knew this morning and then I forgot. Oh, Dorsey. Georgia Tom Dorsey is over here on the right. And so in 1902, so Ma Rainey's born in 1882, sorry, and she was in this show called the Rabbit Foot Minstrels, and she travels in the night throughout the South. Within these, as I say, African American run and led minstrel shows. And in 1902, at the age of 20, she's on a break outside her tent in a small town in Missouri, and she hears a woman outside singing about how her man left her. And the moaning in the song strikes her as odd, and she incorporates it in her repertoire, which is kind of going to become what's called the blues. Now, the blues existed before 1903, 1904, when Ma Rainey starts to sing it. It's just called the blues in this, later. And the first blues song is not copyrighted until around 1914. But blues, in a way, has a long history. Another person who's called the father of the blues, if Ma Rainey's called the mother of the blues, W.C. Handy, who's up here on the left, is called the father of the blues. And this is when an orchestra that he was involved in, which was, again, a minstrel orchestra, African-American singers and producers performing both operas and, old-fashioned Southern songs and things like that. He was in an orchestra called Mahara's Minstrels. And also in 1902, Also in 1902, he hears a Delta blues song in Tutwiler, Mississippi, 90 miles south of Memphis. He's in a very small town waiting for a train, which is 9 hours late because this is the South and trains are never on time in the South. Handy wakes up to hear a man with a guitar with a bottleneck, and he can barely understand the song that this man is singing. And the song is "Going Where the Southern Cross the Dog." And Handy asks him, what's it mean? And the man says that he's going to where the Yazoo and Mississippi Railroad, which is called the Yellow Dog, intersects with the Southern Railroad. And Handy, is interested in the song. He finds it curious. And he writes a song called East St. Louis Blues, which is probably the first written version of the blues. Now, where do blues songs come from? Where does this sort of moaning and whatever come from? It's very distinctive. People talk about it all the way back in the 1880s and 1890s. One part of it is church. And this is churches that were for enslaved and free black people in the South that have a kind of African traditions connected to them. There were a number of churches in the South that were formed in 1865. And we only know about how these churches sounded because the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal, and the AME Zion Church, when they moved from the north to the south, so AME and AME Zion are formed in the north and they come to the south, and the people who are in the church say that they need to take out all the Africanisms that are in Southern black people's worship. They say that there is singing, they say that there is shouting, they say that there is moaning, they say that there's wailing and speaking in tongues. And the AME and the AME Zion Church try to take this out. And so this is the first African church, members of the first African church in Virginia in April of 1865. And this is a kind of a sort of African-inflected religious tradition, which involves singing, often connected to burial songs and things like that, which have this long-delayed sound that we associate with the blues. That's one place where the blues comes from. Another place is the juke joint. And a juke joint, this is from an African-American painter, Elmer Brown, a painting called Gandy Dancer's Gal. And it just and inside it, what we see is a juke joint. So a juke joint is a place that emerges it's on the border between multiple plantations after the war. Beer is served in cups, as you can see here. And there's a certain kind of close-up dancing that takes place in juke joints that's called juking. So we know the word juking 30 years later because we get the word from the mechanical instrument designed for small clubs. It's called a jukebox. The jukebox was designed to be a box that would fit in a juke joint. So juke joints are really common in Mississippi and Louisiana, and there's a kind of playing and singing that takes place in juke joints that's very different. Often what happens is that African-American work songs are translated into a musical tradition that involves one or two guitars, and something called the bones. These guitars are very interesting. They're basically homemade boxes with strings on them. Cheap guitars with relatively few strings. And they're played with what came to be called bar chords, B-A-R-R-E, which is tuned differently. So many notes, you hold down all 6 strings with your finger, as you can see up here, right? The player is holding down all 6 strings, right? So this is the kind of guitar that was used for playing blues music in a juke joint. And it's friends of mine who are guitar players say that it's really hard to learn to do bar chords if you're playing, because you're not used to kind of holding your fingers all the way across all the chords, and you have to tune the guitar differently to play bar chord songs. If a juke had 2 boxes, then one person played the rhythm and another person played the melody, and then a third person would play the bones or tambourine or something like that. Eventually, the very best blues singers figure out a way of kind of thumping on the box at the same time that they're playing, so they can simultaneously play the rhythm and the melody on a single thing. And that's where blues comes from. It's moaning sound sung with little melodic variation, and it becomes kind of trademarked as the blues. It's really a mix of the old field holler, which was sung in plantations as something you sang at the end of work, so the people who knew where you were. The guitar sound that uses the guitar, something like a drum, and church music. And this comes together in what we call the blues. Now, W.C. Handy and Ma Rainey also helped popularize music that's called jazz, which is supposedly earlier, but in fact both of them are around the same time. There's a trademark chord progression, the 12-bar blues and the 8-bar blues. And that's really Handy and Ma Rainey's work. Handy in part because he's a more actually composing these songs, but he takes these very interesting and strange polyrhythms and converts them to a very, very formal structure that is now every blues song has. It's either an 8-bar or 12-bar blues. So you have the complicated polyrhythms of churches and juke joints that's turned into very simple melodic formulas. For our purposes, of course, we cannot talk about this music without talking about a Georgia native, and that is Georgia Tom Dorsey. Let me show you where he is. You go up to Mal Rainey's Black Bottom, which is the name of her band in the 1920s, and that man over there is Georgia Tom Dorsey. He's from rural Georgia, and he moves to Atlanta when he's about 8. Yeah, he moves, and he's from a rural place in Atlanta, and he doesn't dress properly, and the other kids make fun of him at school, and he drops out. His father was what's called a blackleg preacher. A blackleg preacher is a preacher who preaches without a congregation. So he doesn't have a congregation, but he preaches on street corners and things like that, attracting people to listen and to give money, but also sort of to work their way into a congregation, first to become a deacon and then to become a minister. At age 12, he drops out of school and works selling concessions at this place, which is called 81 Theater, which was on the corner of Decatur Street and Central Avenue. It's now torn down. And here we see the coming together of these different, in Georgia Tom, we see the coming together of these multiple musical traditions, right? His father is a blackleg preacher, and he learns the sort of rural music of these African churches, African Baptist churches and things like that in rural Georgia. But he goes to vaudeville, and he also listens to and knows many of the performers in these in this what's it called, this sort of vaudeville routines, some of which are called minstrel shows, and he makes his money playing at what are called rent parties. And these emerge, we don't know when, probably 1902, 1903. In Atlanta, they were called chitlin parties or rent parties. In other parts of the kind of upper South, they're called scuffle parties. And these are parties where basically, they're basically informal parties where someone will announce with a card that they're having a party in their house. They'll usually have a piano in the house, and you come in and you pay a fee to listen to the music and to dance. Dancing in a scuffle party or a chitlin party or a rent party means dancing very, very close together, because you're in a room and there's a whole bunch of people and you still have to dance. And this is an image from a black newspaper on the right, Chicago Defender, actually, around 1920. And it's one of Georgia Tom's songs, "Mama Don't Allow No Easy Riders Here." But this is a place where the scuffle party or the chitlin party or the rent party becomes a place where blues really takes its own form. It goes from these other things to being a kind of musical form, and also becomes a dance form. There's a dance form associated with it. They borrow the unstructured dance steps performed at African American parties both north and south. Rather than holding hands and moving around on the dance floor, dancers shake and jiggle the bottom or the bottom and back, moving legs up and then stopping halfway and spreading legs out. And I do have an image of this that I can show you. This is from Edison's performance. These are black performers in blackface doing what's called the cakewalk, and that's the earliest version we know of. And this is 1903. And this is to blues music, to jazz music. Okay, if you've ever been to if you've ever been to seen a step show by African American fraternities and sororities, this is going to look a little bit familiar. But there are a whole bunch of kinds of musical steps that emerge in this period. Sorry. That's considered very provocative, this dancing, connected with blues music, connected with jazz music. The cakewalk, as it's called in 1900 to 1905, becomes the turkey trot in 1910, a particular kind of dance form, the Texas Tommy in 1911, Ball and the Jack in 1913, the Foxtrot in 1914. Now these are starting to sound like familiar dance moves. Walking the Dog in 1916, the Shimmy in 1917, the Charleston in 1923 and 1924, and the Black Bottom in 1926. So this the dance that's associated with blues music, that with jazz music, becomes its own unique form. Again, coming out of the rural African American South, but becoming sort of distinctively American tradition. These performers of blues and jazz then travel to Europe during World War One. As African American soldiers are fighting in World War I, there are also African American performers that are traveling in these places. And what we see is the sort of both on the Allied side and the Entente side, a fascination with this African American music. They're different from the old minstrel shows in that the music, in some ways, was black people in the North imitating black people in the South, but they made, as you can imagine, some intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois and Walter White very uneasy. As they saw it, they took the traditions from the poorest black Southerners and made them popular. And Du Bois wondered if this was a lampoon to croon about a man leaving you or being poor. Weren't those barrel house tunes being played in bordellos? Wasn't this provocative dancing, according to Du Bois, just imitating sex while standing up? So it's in this period, too, that white radicals, particularly socialists, but also communists, become most attracted to the music. Oh, it's a pretty dangerous trip, although just like the USO during World War II and Korea and places like that, there are attempts to bring musical performances to audiences. And even white GIs wanted the very latest music. And so it is black performers that travel in these regions. It is strange that that they're traveling in the Entente regions too. But Germans become obsessed with African American music in this period, 1918, 1919. They collect it, they listen to it. What's the attraction? Well, part of the attraction, I think, for white radicals, people like Alfred A. Knopf, who dies a very rich man, but in the 1914 is a radical. Booker T. Washington also was not actually fond of this music. I think the important thing about this music is it was very popular among African American folks who were working class folks, but both Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois thought that this music was problematic. So Du Bois talked about the talented tenth. Have you heard that expression? The talented tenth would be the 10% of African Americans who are sort of more well off, who are educated in universities. Du Bois himself went to Harvard. And Du Bois believed that uplift had to come from the talented tenth. Booker T. Washington was less clear about that. But neither of them really liked this music because they thought it was bawdy and they thought it made black people look bad. But it was incredibly popular among working class people in the South. So among construction workers, for example, Italians would knew opera songs, and they would whistle opera songs. Irish people would whistle jigs, and African American workers, when they worked on construction sites, would whistle blues songs. So it was very, very popular among working class folks. But the people who kind of saw themselves as sort of cultural leaders, like Du Bois and Washington, were somewhat bothered by this music because they thought of it as sort of gutter music, barrel house music. Barrel houses is basically the kind of barrel that you throw garbage into. So what's the interest? What's the fascination here with this music? Well, part of it is Freud. People driven by deep sexual desires, and so this sort of almost but not quite explicit sexuality in the dancing and in the music. in the songs themselves are pretty bawdy. You know, My Baby Rocks Me with One Steady Roll. Uh, that's the first blues song that has the word rock and roll in it. Uh, there's the fascination too with during the war, a sense that the war is this horrible thing, right? It's an industrial war in which the seemingly the most powerful civilizations in the world are killing each other by the millions, right? Tens of millions of people dying in World War One, and so many people feel that this sort of over-civilized Europe that was supposed to be the center of the world, was supposed to be the center of culture and civilization, all these other sorts of things, has failed. And so, for people who are called the lost generation, people like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, John Dos Passos, they're people who grow up during World War One. They believe that sort of civilization as they know it is over, collapsed, and they reject the civilization and progress. They believe that civilization and progress only leads to war, and they too become fascinated by African American music because they see it as some better and deeper. They saw Imperial Germany versus Imperial France. They feel that the society has become deceptive and a profit motive, and so their attraction to black culture of the South is that African Americans are excluded, right, from new corporations, from high society, from big factories, and maybe that's better. So there's a kind of a racist, I have to say, view here that African Americans are kind of closer to nature somehow, and that they're not over civilized and that sort of thing. And it is a kind of a racist view, but it leads to this sort of obsession or fascination with this black culture that's also incredibly popular with African Americans as well. Yeah, it's kind of a noble savage thing. That's a great way of putting it. So it's a weird view. It's kind of racist that black people feel things more deeply, or that performers are closer to true human emotion or something like that than this over civilized world. They're idealized by communists because African Americans are seen as the sort of ultimate downtrodden worker. Socialists and communists want revolution to be spread by workers, and few people, they say, work harder for lower wages than black men and women. But I have to say, I would say that blues and jazz are incredibly popular among African Americans in this period, and they're really the kind of fun and fundament of much of the modern culture that becomes American culture in the 21st century. And it's not really political, I don't think, in quite the way that Fitzgerald and Hemingway and others thought it was. But it was, a sort of distinctive, very distinctive cultural production that's still incredibly productive. Let me end with, I don't know if you've the step show. I was just talking to my wife about this, who's a historian also. The step show, which is very popular in. Yeah, that's a good point. There's very quickly the step show. We think about it is, I don't know if you've seen it. You Google it, I guess, step show, but it's African American fraternities and sororities have it. There's a lot of singing and dancing and clapping legs and things like that. This is not actually. It has an African roots, but the African roots actually go back to South Africa, and they go back to a whole bunch of African American students in historically black colleges and universities, particularly Howard and others, traveling to South Africa in the 19-teens and 1920s, and then returning to black fraternities and sororities and bringing back what's called gumshoe dancing, which was done by black miners. So this idea that there's just, this is some backward tradition is actually not true, that this is actually a vibrant tradition that pulls from many, many different places. About this Elmer Brown, he's 1941. It is a kind of a colorful thing. There is a kind of, it looks a little bit like Diego Rivera, doesn't it? I think he is influenced by Diego Rivera, who was a communist painter. I think the other thing is that Brown didn't make his reputation in his lifetime as a painter. He made his reputation as a graphic designer. And so there's more of a kind of cartoon-like quality to the way that he paints with slightly exaggerated features. Like this arm is sort of impossibly thick. This shoulder is almost cartoon-like. And so I think that that's part of what's going on in Brown's painting here is that there's I don't think Brown himself was especially political. I think he died in 1941. Or no, sorry, the painting is from 1941, but it describes a time going back to the 19-teens and such. And I think the propaganda style is really just a reflection of his style, which is more of a which is more of a yeah, just a sort of distinctive style. So let me just conclude by talking about the world after World War One. After World War One, we see African American GIs returning from the war and being treated very differently in Europe than they have been treated in the United States. In fact, French and French troops and British troops and others treating them as these soldiers are the people who are helping them. For French people, these are liberators, in Belgium as well. And this leads, when African Americans return, to black men not being really willing to take the abuse that they had in the South. And so we see many people standing up to sort of ill treatment that was common in the South. And this is what leads to a series of attacks on black communities that is called Red Summer. In Longview, Texas, in Washington, D.C., in Chicago, and elsewhere. It's very much like the Atlanta race riot of 1906, in which white people kind of storm into town and particularly wealthy, not well, kind of more well-off parts of African American communities and attack them. And it's in this period that we see, right, the what's called the New Negro movement. Initially, this is a sort of socialist movement, but after gradually it becomes a kind of cultural movement that grows up in New York, Harlem in particular, Chicago, and Philadelphia, elsewhere, kind of pushing back, fighting back against this attack, an unwillingness for former GIs to put up with mayhem and attack. Okay, so again, a dog's breakfast. We talked about Southern white music and Southern African American music and how both of them become hugely important kind of cultural traditions. In fact, arguably the biggest cultural exports of the United States in the 21st century are these sort of musical traditions that come out of the South, the sort of what later becomes the folk music revival, reviving songs that are produced among white Southerners, but also reviving these African-inflected traditions that stay in the segregated South. Weirdly, the segregated South, it helps to kind of keep alive white musical traditions and black musical traditions that go on to become important parts of what we call American music. All right. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for helping me get rid of Gabe for getting rid of my troll.